Your Honor, I need a moment. The courtroom fell silent. For a second I thought I had misheard him. Tom's attorney, Robert Chambers, one of the most respected divorce lawyers in Northern Virginia, had been smiling just moments earlier. Confident, relaxed, certain he was about to help my husband take me apart piece by piece. Now he was standing so abruptly his chair nearly tipped over. The judge adjusted her glasses. Mr. Chambers. Robert stared at the photograph lying on the table between us. His face had gone completely white. Across the room my husband frowned. What's going on? Tom asked. Robert didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the image. Then he looked at me, not at the 62-year-old woman sitting quietly in a navy blazer, not at the wife he had seen in court filings, at me, the person he suddenly recognized. Your Honor, he repeated carefully, I need a brief recess. For the first time that morning my husband stopped smiling, and for the first time in 32 years, I realized the truth might finally have a chance to speak for itself. My name is Margaret Hayes, and until that moment almost everyone in my life believed I had spent my military career as a secretary, including my husband, especially my husband. The divorce hearing had started exactly the way I expected. Tom sat confidently beside his attorney. His expensive suit looked freshly pressed. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He looked like a man who believed victory was inevitable. I sat alone. No attorney. No dramatic speeches. No attempt to impress anyone. Just me and a folder of documents. Tom had filed for divorce 8 months earlier. According to him, our marriage had run its course. That was the phrase he used. Not the affair. Not the lies. Not the weekends he spent with another woman while telling me he was traveling for work. Just a marriage that had somehow run its course. The truth was much uglier. After 32 years together, Tom had fallen in love with a woman nearly 20 years younger. A marketing executive from his consulting firm. Someone who laughed at his jokes and admired his stories. Someone who knew nothing about the sacrifices required to build the life he enjoyed. When I discovered the affair, he didn't apologize. He didn't even seem embarrassed. Instead, he acted relieved, as if honesty had finally become convenient. The months that followed were painful. Not because I wanted him back. That chapter was already over. What hurt was realizing how little he had ever understood me, or tried to understand me. During our marriage, Tom loved introducing himself. He loved discussing his achievements, his promotions, his contracts, his connections. Whenever people asked about me, he always used the same phrase. Margaret handled paperwork on base. That was it. Sometimes he called me a secretary, sometimes an administrative assistant. People nodded politely. Then they returned their attention to him. I rarely corrected them. Not because I was ashamed, because I couldn't. Much of my military career had been protected by security classifications for decades. Some records remained restricted even now. Silence had become a habit. Unfortunately, silence often looks like weakness to people who don't understand it, especially people like Tom. That morning, his attorney had leaned heavily into that perception. She was never the primary earner, Robert argued. She spent most of her career in support roles. Support roles. Interesting phrase. Tom smirked when he heard it. Then came the comment that changed everything. Tom looked directly at me. The same way he used to when he wanted to humiliate me in front of friends. You were a secretary, Margaret, he said with a laugh. Not a soldier. Several people turned toward us. The judge immediately frowned. But the damage had already been done. The words hung in the air. Not because they hurt, because they were so completely wrong. I looked at the man I had shared a home with for more than 3 decades. The father of my children. The person who should have known me better than anyone else. And I realized something. Tom genuinely believed what he was saying. That was the saddest part. He wasn't lying. He simply never cared enough to learn the truth. I opened my folder, removed a single photograph, and slid it across the table toward Robert. At first he glanced at it casually. Then his expression changed. His eyes widened. His hand froze. The room disappeared around him. I recognized that reaction immediately. Recognition. Not of my face. Of the event shown in the photograph. An event that had once made headlines inside military circles. An event connected to people Robert had encountered early in his legal career. People he respected. People he remembered. People standing beside me in that picture. The attorney picked up the photograph, studied it again, then looked at the name printed beneath it. A name he apparently never expected to see. Mine. The judge cleared her throat. Mr. Chambers. Robert slowly stood. His voice sounded different now. Careful. Measured. Almost nervous. Your Honor, I need a brief recess. Tom stared at him. Robert. No response. The attorney continued looking at me. Suddenly my husband wasn't the most confident person in the room anymore. And deep inside I knew something important had just begun. Because the photograph was only the first piece of the story. The records were coming next. And once they arrived, the man sitting across from me would discover that the woman he called a secretary had spent an entire lifetime protecting secrets far bigger than he could imagine. The courtroom recessed for 15 minutes. 15 minutes, that was all. But when everyone returned, the atmosphere had changed completely. Robert Chambers no longer looked like a man preparing to win an easy divorce case. He looked like a man trying to understand how he had walked into something far bigger than he expected. Tom noticed it too. I could see it in his eyes. Confusion. Concern. The first small cracks in the confidence he had carried all morning. The judge resumed proceedings, but my thoughts drifted backward. Back to another lifetime. Back to the young woman nobody seemed to remember, including the man I had married. I was 22 years old when I entered military service. It was the early 1980s. The Cold War still shaped much of America's military strategy. Most people expected women to occupy support positions. Some believed that was all we were capable of. I learned early not to waste energy arguing with those assumptions. The best response was competence. I graduated near the top of my training class. A senior officer noticed my aptitude for analysis and strategic planning. Within 2 years, I found myself working in areas few people outside the military even knew existed. The work wasn't glamorous. There were no movie-style action scenes, no dramatic speeches, no heroic music. Mostly there were long hours, endless reports, maps, intelligence assessments, patterns hidden inside mountains of information. But sometimes lives depended on finding those patterns. Sometimes entire operations depended on someone noticing a detail everyone else overlooked. I became very good at that. Very good. By the time I was 30, I had earned a reputation for solving problems quietly. The kind of reputation that opened doors. The kind that attracted attention from senior leadership. The kind that never appeared in newspapers. Most of what I accomplished couldn't be discussed publicly. Even today there are details I still cannot share. But I can say this. More than once, decisions influenced by my work helped prevent American service members from walking into situations that could have ended in disaster. That knowledge was enough. Recognition wasn't the goal. The mission was. Around that same time I met Tom. He was charming, confident, funny. The kind of man who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. At first I admired that. My own personality was quieter, more reserved. We balanced each other, or at least I thought we did. Tom never fully understood what I did for the military. At first that wasn't his fault. Much of it was classified. I couldn't tell him details, couldn't explain where I went, couldn't discuss specific projects. So when friends asked about my career, Tom simplified it. She's in administration. She's on paperwork. She's behind the scenes. I would smile and let it go. After all, I wasn't allowed to explain the truth. Years passed. The simplifications became assumptions. The assumptions became beliefs. Eventually, even our children grew up hearing versions of the same story. Mom worked on military paperwork. Mom handled reports. Mom sat behind a desk. None of those statements were technically false. But they weren't the truth either. The real truth remained locked away inside secure files. Sometimes I wondered whether silence carried its own cost, whether protecting secrets had slowly erased parts of my identity. But by then it was simply the way life worked. I accepted it. The military eventually became my second family. I worked alongside extraordinary people, men and women whose names will never appear in history books, people who sacrificed recognition for service, people who understood that some victories must remain invisible. One of those people was General William Carter. At the time, he was a rising star within military leadership, sharp, disciplined, respected throughout the Pentagon. We worked together during a particularly difficult operation. The details remain classified even now, but the outcome changed careers, including mine. After the operation concluded successfully, a photograph was taken. Nothing dramatic, just several officers standing together, smiling, relieved, proud. One picture among thousands taken throughout military history. Most people would see nothing remarkable, but military professionals recognized the context immediately, especially those connected to military law and command structures, like Robert Chambers. Years before becoming a prominent civilian attorney, Robert had served briefly as a JAG officer, a military lawyer, young, ambitious, eager to learn. During that period, he encountered records related to the operation shown in that photograph. Not many people did, which explained why his reaction had been so immediate. So intense. He recognized the faces, the event, and most importantly, the woman standing beside General Carter, me. Back in the courtroom, Robert reviewed several newly obtained documents. His expression remained serious. Tom leaned toward him. "What is this?" he whispered. Robert didn't answer. Instead, he continued reading. Page after page. His discomfort grew more obvious with each passing minute. For the first time I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Sadness. Because Tom wasn't discovering a secret. He was discovering a part of his wife he never bothered to know. 32 years. 32 years of marriage. And he was learning who I was from legal documents. The realization hurt more than the affair ever had. Then Robert reached the final page. He slowly looked up. Directly at me. And in that moment I knew the records he held would change everything. Not just the divorce. The entire story my husband had spent decades telling about me. The following Monday the courtroom was full. Far fuller than it had been during the first hearing. Word had spread. Not through the media. Not yet. But among attorneys, veterans, and retired military personnel throughout Northern Virginia, something unusual was happening. A routine divorce case had suddenly become the subject of quiet conversations. I arrived early and sat in the same seat as before. Calm, silent, prepared. Across the room Tom looked exhausted. The confidence that had once surrounded him was gone. His posture had changed. His smile had disappeared. For 3 days he had been asking questions. Questions nobody seemed willing to answer directly. The only response he received was always the same. You should wait for the hearing. That answer clearly frustrated him. For most of his life, Tom had been the person who controlled the narrative. The person with all the answers. Now he was the one being left in the dark, and he hated it. The judge entered. Everyone stood. After the usual formalities, Robert Chambers rose slowly. Gone was the aggressive attorney who had mocked my career. Gone was the confidence. He looked almost uncomfortable. Your Honor, he said carefully before proceeding, I would like to clarify certain statements previously made regarding Mrs. Hayes's military service. The judge nodded. Proceed. Robert inhaled, then glanced briefly toward me. Several assumptions presented during the earlier hearing were inaccurate. Tom turned toward him immediately. What are you doing? The judge shot him a warning look. Mr. Hayes remained silent. The courtroom grew still. Robert continued. Mrs. Hayes did not serve in an administrative capacity as previously suggested. A murmur spread through the gallery. Tom stared. His confusion deepened. The attorney opened a folder. Inside were documents recently released through military channels. Not classified anymore. Not secret. Just delayed by decades. The truth finally catching up to time. Robert handed the documents to the judge. She reviewed them carefully. 1 page. Then another. Then another. The expression on her face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. The judge looked toward me, then back at the records. Interesting, she said quietly. Very interesting. Tom shifted uneasily in his chair. For the first time he looked afraid. The judge began reading portions of the file into the record. Commendations. Citations. Letters from commanding officers. Evaluations. Recognition for contributions to multiple strategic operations. The words echoed through the courtroom. Each sentence dismantled another piece of the story Tom had told everyone for years. The secretary, the paperwork clerk, the woman who supposedly spent her career filing reports. Gone. Replaced by documented facts. Then came the statement from General William Carter. Although unable to attend in person due to health concerns, he had submitted a sworn declaration. The courtroom listened carefully as the judge read excerpts. Mrs. Margaret Hayes demonstrated exceptional judgment under extraordinary circumstances. She contributed significantly to operational success. Her analysis prevented decisions that could have placed American personnel at unacceptable risk. She earned the respect of every senior officer who worked alongside her. The room fell silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Tom looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. I didn't enjoy watching him suffer. I truly didn't. What hurt wasn't his embarrassment. What hurt was knowing that none of this surprised me. Because I had lived it. Every sacrifice. Every sleepless night. Every deployment, every classified briefing, every moment spent carrying responsibilities I could never discuss at home. The achievements weren't new, only the audience was. Then something unexpected happened. The judge looked directly at Tom. Did you know any of this? Tom swallowed. No, Your Honor. The answer came out almost as a whisper. Why not? He didn't respond immediately. Neither would I have. How do you explain 32 years of not asking enough questions? How do you explain building an entire image of someone without ever truly listening to them? Tom lowered his eyes. I thought I knew her. The honesty in that sentence struck harder than anything else that morning. Because for once he wasn't defending himself. He wasn't making excuses. He was simply acknowledging the truth, and the truth was painful. The hearing continued. But the surprises weren't over. While reviewing financial disclosures, the court discovered discrepancies. Several of them. Accounts that had not been fully reported. Assets transferred before the divorce filing. Investments that should have appeared in disclosure statements but didn't. The judge's expression hardened. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "do you wish to explain these omissions?" Tom's face lost what little color remained. Robert closed his eyes briefly. The attorney already knew. This wasn't a mistake. This was trouble. Serious trouble. Suddenly the focus of the hearing shifted. The issue was no longer my military career. It was my husband's honesty. The judge ordered additional documentation, additional review, additional disclosures. The divorce case had become far more complicated than Tom ever anticipated. As the session ended, people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Several veterans approached me. One elderly man stopped beside my chair. He wore a faded Marine Corps pin. "I never knew your story," he said softly. I smiled. "Most people didn't." He nodded, then offered a simple salute. Not formal, not military, just respectful. I returned the gesture with a small nod. Across the room, Tom watched the exchange. His eyes followed every person who approached me. Every veteran, every retired officer, every individual who seemed to recognize something in me that he had never bothered to see. And for the first time since our marriage began falling apart, I saw genuine regret in his face. Not because he might lose money, not because he might lose the case, because he was finally beginning to understand what he had already lost. 3 weeks later, the courtroom filled once again. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. The curiosity was gone. The speculation had faded. Now people came because they wanted to see how the story would end. I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. Not the kind most people imagine. I didn't want Tom humiliated. I didn't want him ruined. At 62 years old, I'd learned that revenge rarely heals anything. What I wanted was something simpler. The truth. Just the truth. For decades, people had accepted a version of my life that wasn't real. Now the truth was finally standing in daylight. And daylight has a way of revealing everything, including things people desperately try to hide. The judge entered promptly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. Tom looked older than he had a month earlier. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence that once defined him seemed to have disappeared entirely. His shoulders slumped. His eyes avoided mine. For the first time since our separation, I felt sorry for him. Not because he was facing consequences, because consequences are part of life. I felt sorry because he was finally confronting himself. And that's often harder than facing a courtroom. The hearing began with the financial review. Additional records had been collected. Additional accounts had been examined. Additional transactions had been traced. The findings were not favorable for Tom. Several investment accounts had been moved before the divorce filing. Property transfers had occurred without proper disclosure. Money had quietly shifted from one place to another. Nothing criminal, but certainly dishonest. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. Then she looked over her glasses. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her voice remained calm. "Marriage requires trust." She paused. "So does the legal process." Tom lowered his head. The courtroom remained silent. There was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to explain away. The evidence spoke clearly enough. The judge eventually issued her ruling. The hidden assets would be included in the marital estate. The settlement would be adjusted accordingly. Everything would be divided fairly. Fairly. Not generously. Not harshly. Fairly. That single word mattered more to me than any financial outcome. Because fairness had been missing from our marriage for a very long time. The ruling concluded. The case was essentially over. But something unexpected happened after the hearing. People began approaching me, one after another. Veterans, retired officers, military spouses, even complete strangers. Some shook my hand. Others simply thanked me. A retired Air Force colonel handed me a folded note. "Your story matters," he said quietly. "More than you know." I slipped the note into my purse. Then another woman approached. She looked to be in her 70s. "I spent 20 years married to a Navy pilot," she said. "My husband never talked much about what he did." She smiled gently. "I think I understand your silence." For a moment neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Some experiences require no explanation. By the end of the afternoon I had received dozens of messages, letters, emails, phone calls. Many came from veterans, others came from family members of veterans. Most shared the same theme. People often underestimate sacrifices they cannot see. That realization stayed with me. For years I had viewed my silence as a personal burden. Now I began to understand something different. Perhaps sharing parts of my story could help others. Perhaps silence didn't always have to be permanent. A few days later our children came to visit. All 3 of them. The request surprised me. We hadn't spent much time together since the divorce proceedings began. The tension had been difficult for everyone. When they arrived, nobody seemed sure how to start the conversation. Finally, our daughter Emily spoke first. Tears filled her eyes. Mom, she said softly. We didn't know. I nodded. I know. You should have told us. There was no accusation in her voice. Only sadness. I considered her words carefully. Maybe I said, or maybe you should have asked. The room became quiet, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. My youngest son looked down at his hands. I believe Dad, he admitted. The honesty hurt, but not because he said it. Because I understood why. Children trust the stories they hear repeatedly, especially when those stories come from parents. I know I told him. You were supposed to. Emily wiped her eyes. I'm sorry. The words broke something loose inside me. Not anger, not resentment. Something much gentler. Forgiveness. Real forgiveness. Not because they had earned it. Because holding on to hurt no longer served any purpose. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You don't owe me punishment, I said. You owe me understanding. She nodded, then cried harder. Before the afternoon ended, we spent hours talking. Really talking. For perhaps the first time in years. Questions were asked. Stories were shared. Misunderstandings slowly dissolved. A bridge began rebuilding itself. Not perfectly. Not instantly. But honestly, several days later I received a phone call. The number looked familiar. When I answered, I immediately recognized the voice. Tom. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. Margaret. Yes. Another pause. I was wondering, he said carefully, if you'd meet me somewhere. I leaned back in my chair. For what? His answer came softly. Because after 32 years, I think I'd finally like to hear your story. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed he meant it. The Veterans Memorial stood quietly beneath a clear Virginia sky. Rows of stone markers stretched across the hillside. Names, dates, stories, lives, some remembered by history. Most remembered only by family. It seemed like the right place to meet. Tom was already sitting on a bench when I arrived. For a moment, neither of us moved. We looked older than the couple who had stood before a minister 32 years earlier. Older, wiser perhaps, certainly more honest. I sat beside him. Not too close, not too far. The distance felt appropriate. Tom stared at the memorial for several seconds before speaking. I almost didn't come. I smiled faintly. I almost didn't either. That earned the first genuine laugh I had heard from him in months. It disappeared quickly. What happened in court? He began. His voice cracked. I deserved that. I shook my head. No. He looked surprised. You didn't. No. I turned toward him. You deserved the truth. The words settled between us. Simple. Unavoidable. True. Tom looked down at his hands. For the first time in our marriage, I saw a man who wasn't trying to defend himself. Wasn't trying to win. Wasn't trying to impress anyone. Just a man trying to understand where he had gone wrong. I spent weeks thinking about everything he said quietly. The affair. The divorce. The lies. He swallowed hard. But none of that keeps me awake at night. I waited. What keeps me awake is realizing I never really knew my own wife. The pain in his voice surprised me. Not because it existed. Because it was genuine. I knew what you liked for breakfast, he continued. I knew your favorite movie. I knew how you took your coffee. He laughed bitterly. But I never knew who you were. I looked out across the memorial. For years that realization would have felt like a victory. Now it simply felt sad. We were both responsible for that, I said. Tom frowned. How? I hid behind silence. His eyes lifted. You had no choice. Sometimes I did. I thought about all the years I had allowed assumptions to stand unchallenged. All the conversations I had avoided. All the opportunities to share small pieces of myself. Not classified information. Just myself. Keeping secrets for the military became easier than being vulnerable at home. Tom absorbed that quietly. The wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance a flag snapped softly. Finally he spoke. I owe you an apology. I didn't respond. I wanted to hear the rest. Not because of the settlement. Not because of the court. Not because I lost. His voice grew softer. I owe you an apology because I spent years reducing you to something smaller than you were. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they erased the past. Because they acknowledged it. Every time I called you a secretary. Every time I made a joke. Every time I acted like my work mattered more. He looked away. I was wrong. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. Thank you. No dramatic confrontation. No emotional explosion. Just 2 words. Sometimes that's enough. Tom exhaled slowly. You know what's strange? What? The military records weren't what changed my mind. That surprised me. What did... He smiled sadly. The kids. I tilted my head. What about them? After they visited you, they wouldn't stop talking about you. His eyes softened. They were proud. I felt emotion rise unexpectedly in my chest. Emily told me she finally understood where she got her strength. A tear escaped before I could stop it. Tom noticed. For once he didn't look away. I spent years chasing recognition, he said. Promotions, titles, money. He gestured toward the memorial. Those people out there understood something I never did. I followed his gaze. What? Real honor isn't about being seen. The words lingered. Real honor isn't about being seen. For decades I had lived exactly that truth. Service without applause. Sacrifice without recognition. Duty without reward. And somehow hearing it from Tom mattered. Not because I needed validation. Because growth is beautiful when it finally arrives. Even late. Especially late. We sat together for another hour. Talking. Remembering. Laughing occasionally. Not as husband and wife. That chapter had ended. But perhaps as something else. Two people who finally saw each other clearly. Before leaving, Tom stood. So what happens now? I smiled. Now we move forward. Separately. Peacefully. Honestly? He nodded. Then, after a brief hesitation, he extended his hand. I shook it. A simple gesture. A respectful ending. As I walked toward my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had won a court case. Not because my reputation had been restored. Not because people finally knew the truth. I felt lighter because I no longer needed anyone's approval. Not Tom's. Not society's. Not even history's. The truth had done its work. And that was enough. If this story touched you, take a moment to think about the people in your own life. The quiet ones. The humble ones. The people whose sacrifices may never appear on a resume or a trophy shelf. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one saying the least. If you believe